I am a migration scholar with training in anthropology, and I am very honored to be moderating this webinar organized by the Center for Migration Studies. I've lost count how many we have had, but quite a few. As you know, we are recording this, so you'll be able to return to it if you want to, remind yourself about it. We have a pleasure to welcome Dr. Daria Krivonos, who is a sociologist and currently doing a postdoc physically at the moment sitting in the other city in the country, namely Warsaw. She is doing a postdoc in the Center of Excellence in Law, Identity, and the European Narratives at the University of Helsinki. And I've Googled her a little bit, and it seems like she has a really tremendous research agenda focused on all sorts of things related to labor migration, radicalization, but also looking at systems and how systems facilitate or impede a labor migration and successful livelihoods and that sort of thing. So without further ado, we will let her begin her presentation. I am encouraging the audience to write their questions or comments in the chat room, although I will also open it for just raising a hand at the end of Daria's presentation. So hold on with questions for now, and then we hopefully will have a lively discussion. So Daria, the floor is yours, or the screen is yours.
Yes, good morning, everyone. And thank you very much for your invitation and for your very kind introduction. I'm really excited to be here and discuss my research together and think together. So indeed, I'm currently in the middle of my fieldwork, which of course makes it very difficult to present any findings when we found ourselves in a new reality, but I'll still try to say something and share my thoughts. I'm starting to share the screen. Can you see it? Yes.
Yes.
I would like to start my talk with some ethnographic reflections from my previous field trip to Warsaw in 2020, which I believe can give us a longer term perspective on the current situation with Ukrainian refugees in Finland. And I'll start my talk with a short ethnographic vignette. So as we were passing by brightly lit skyscrapers in the center of Warsaw, late in the evening in February 2020, when the world was about to change once again because of the pandemic, my research interlocutor, whom I call Volodya, said, you see this, everything here was built by Ukrainians. Volodya, like many other research participants of mine, moved to Warsaw from Ukraine as a student and soon became what sociologist Brett Nielsen called a student migrant worker, making pizzas and delivering food in a popular chain of restaurants. A couple of days later, I met Karina, whom I met in the newly built up-and-coming district of Warsaw. Unlike many others, Karina was a doctor in a private company and was one of the few people who was employed in a high-income sector of labor. And indeed, she invited me in a kind of a fancy-looking restaurant. And as we were walking around her district, she started pointing to different enterprises and business activities around herself. She said, you see that sushi place? Ukrainians work there. The new bakery is also run by Ukrainians. That spa place, Ukrainian women work there. So these are some of the accounts I got during my field trip in Warsaw in 2020. And this month I came back to Warsaw to continue my field work, but already in a new context of the full-scale imperial invasion of Ukraine by Russia, when many Ukrainian migrant workers became refugees and are now expected to become reabsorbed as labor again. And most of the things I'm going to say today rely on the data I collected in 2020, before the pandemic and before the war, which nevertheless, I believe can give us a longer term perspective on Ukrainian migration. And now when we can see a surge of interest in Ukraine and Ukrainian refugees for obvious reasons, but before the war, internationally, scholars of migration were rather reluctant to look into eastern borders of the EU and Ukrainian migration specifically, even though it represented some of the most intensive mobilities of labor to the EU. And this circulation of labor is reflected in the accounts by Volodya and Karina, whom I mentioned earlier. As they said, everything here in Warsaw was built by Ukrainians. But compared to other geographies, scholars of migration internationally have been less willing to look into this part of the world and this type of migration. And I say internationally because, of course, I know that both in Poland and Ukraine, a lot of research was done on this topic. And what I want to do in this talk is to offer some reflections on the recent representations of this refugee migration and constructions of Ukrainian migrants as white, and the dominant narration of Ukrainian refugee migration as a humanitarian issue, where Ukrainian refugees are depicted as the recipients of help offered by generous Europeans. And here, of course, I want to recognize that temporary protection directive, for example, granted to Ukrainian citizens is indeed a relative privilege which other refugees don't have. And recently, many commentators voiced some important critique regarding a very rapid mobilization of solidarity around Ukrainian refugees and the double standards regarding treatment of other refugees. And indeed, the 2.5 million asylum claims in the EU in 2015-2016 were framed as a refugee crisis and the external danger to the EU. And then we could see how the discourse of crisis was productive and led to further strategies of border securitization. So what we could already learn from the current situation is that crisis is never really about numbers, at least like on the EU level. And what these different framings make visible is a hierarchical grading of humanity and unequal deservingness of protection and asylum. And again, this is nothing new because migration research has long shown how European asylum regime, even before the war in Ukraine, was based on racialized distinctions between authentic refugees, economic migrants, and bogus asylum seekers. But in addition to that, when we look at the framing of Ukrainian refugee migration now, I think that two things become visible. The first thing is that Ukrainian refugees are constructed in racialized terms as white. And here I mean people belonging to white majority population in Ukraine, as we also witnessed several accounts when students from the African continent studying in Ukraine had major difficulties crossing the border to Poland, or a situation of Ukrainian Roma who get expelled from refugee reception centers here in Warsaw, for example. And indeed, some media commentaries argued that it is precisely Ukrainian whiteness which enabled a rather unprecedented and certainly welcomed decision to grant temporary protection to Ukrainian refugees, unlike in the cases of other non-European refugees who have had to wait for their decision on their applications for years or even a decade. And the second thing, which I think partly relates to this previous point, is the figure of generous Europeans standing with Ukraine. And indeed, today we see many hashtags and mobilization of solidarity, hashtags we stand with Ukraine. So we kind of see this figure of us, Europeans, becoming sort of centered in these discussions. And what I notice now is how posters in Warsaw Metro, who used to advertise recruitment of Ukrainian workers in 2020, are now changed to we stand with Ukraine in 2022. And of course, this symbolic and indeed material mobilization of solidarity is very much welcome and important, but I suggest that this framing leaves undiscussed some longer term ties between Ukrainian labor and the EU economies, and the longer term contribution of Ukrainian migrant workers who were already in the EU and in Poland, and who now bear the costs of social reproduction of their families fleeing the war with Russia. So what I want to do in this presentation, to conclude my very long introduction, is to look into how the construction of Ukrainian refugees as white became possible only recently, and how whiteness is fluid, contextual, and historically specific. And I also want to do that by bringing a longer-term perspective on Ukrainian migration to Europe and bring back the importance and the role that Ukrainian labor has long played in the European economy. And for a really long time, I think migration research has been preoccupied with humanitarian migration and responses to humanitarian crisis, while questions of labor, the labor of refugees and their families to sustain life have been somewhat less important, it seems. And by bringing the questions of labor to the discussion of racialization and migration, I also want to kind of remind that migrants and refugees are not only subject to humanitarian assistance, but are active agents in global racial capitalism as they become integrated into racialized and gendered labor markets. And this is the question I think that we should be asking ourselves when we say that migrants and refugees must get integrated. So the question is, in what kind of labor markets they will get integrated. And as sociologist Prem Kumar Rajaram argues, refugees and migrants are often studied as though they have no relation to the racial and class structures of the societies in which they reside. And instead, they're seen as strangers that need to be governed by integration policies and border management. But the fact is that the survival of refugees and migrants impedes largely on self-reliance, which turns refugees into disposable subjects in capitalism. And here Poland is a very interesting case as it combines extensive out-migration, which with economic growth has led to significant unfulfilled labor demand. And well, we know that Poland has been transitioning from a migrant-sending country to a top receiver of labor migrants in the EU, and now refugees as well, from its neighboring state, Ukraine. And Poland has had a very liberal labor migration policy, and together with a visa-free regime for Ukrainian citizens, migration from Ukraine became a significant reservoir of labor coming to Central and Eastern Europe. So these are the things that really interested me when I started my research in 2020, like the question of labor in migration. And since I was really new to Warsaw and my initial contacts were mainly among some friends, their relatives and friends of friends, I quickly and easily gained access to young Ukrainian students. And the young people I interviewed were predominantly students and student workers who had come to Poland to get higher education right after finishing high school in Ukraine. So these were really young people in their early 20s. And even though usually when we talk about labor migration and labor migrants, we don't talk about students. In fact, everyone I talked to started working really early on during their bachelor studies. And many of them were employed in the service sector jobs with rather insecure employment contracts or without contracts even. And what I learned very quickly is that many young people would use the services of the informal paperwork market. And that can be explained by the fact that while temporary and circular labor migration has been encouraged and facilitated by the Polish legislation, the channels for establishing a longer-term residence in Poland has been quite limited. And this can be explained by Poland's migration policy, which is conducted towards temporary migration. And the young people I talked to would often tell me that their student residence permit applications would be simply rejected after taking almost a year of considering their application, or even they would get the Karta Pobytu, they would wait for 9 months and then they would have only 3 months left with which they could reside legally in Poland. So they would need to reapply again. And during all this time of waiting, they can't leave Poland, or they can leave, but they can't enter it again. So despite these attempts to immobilize workers and tie them to employers, migrants also challenge these regimes of bordering and bureaucracy. And here I also, in 2020, when I was doing observations and just spending time in Warszawa Zachodnia bus station, that's the bus station where a lot of buses are circulating between Ukraine and Poland. So then a young man passed me by. I was standing at the entrance, and a young man passed me by and gave me a little folded business card. And the card said, "Services for foreigners," in Polish. And as I opened the card, it said in Ukrainian, "Our services offering help with getting a residence permit, citizenship, a bank certificate, and a job invitation." So, and as I continued doing interviews with young Ukrainian student workers, I got to know that brokers and intermediary companies were very popular among Ukrainian migrants willing to ease the bureaucratic burden of immigration controls. So it becomes clear that one of the sides where the struggle between capital and migrant labor is lived is the regime of borders, documents, and bureaucracy. So while borders and immigration controls, as we know, aim at disciplining migrant laboring bodies and making them productive, people also manage to subvert and desert from control, which of course has the other side of the coin, because people can become vulnerable to scams and to some kind of intermediary companies which just get money from them and they gave them fake papers. But it's interesting to look into how people try to challenge this administrative bordering through the informal paperwork market. And for example, from Andrei, I learned how people can use certain visas strategically for regularizing their status and having more mobility in the labor market. And Andrei moved to Warsaw as a student, and after finishing his bachelor degree, he signed up to a vocational school, Szkoła Policjalna, to get a visa that allowed him to change jobs without changing a visa. And how he says, all the Ukrainians, just like myself, my friends from the university, we all found out about the vocational school and we all applied there. It is simply convenient. We are all there now. We do that for the documents. If you get a residence permit, Karta Pobyta, based on employment, you must work there all the time. And if you leave the job, you lose your residence permit. But if you are a student, you can work wherever you want. You won't lose your permit if you change the job. And in fact, it's very interesting, as Andrei was running his own little construction firm while staying in Poland with a student visa and also employing other workers through a student visa and this vocational school. He also explained that sometimes no teaching takes place in these vocational schools, as they exist, as he says, only for Ukrainian migrants to get their student visas. And the reason why student visas were so popular, even among the people who were not so willing to study, or they finished their studies already, is that the student visa allowed more mobility in the labor market, and it didn't tie workers to their employer in case, as in the case of a work permit. So here we can see this strategic engagement with administrative bordering, which makes it easier to change jobs and employers. And here I have Igor's story, who is a fresh university graduate, or who was a fresh graduate when I talked to him, and who told me how people cope with the requirement to show the guarantee of income to get a student visa. He told me, just Google buy a bank certificate for residence permit. You will see dozens of websites. People sell these certificates for 200 or 300 zlotys. You come to a bank, a person transfers you 15 to 20,000 zlotys. The bank gives you a certificate, you transfer the money back, that's all. You see, Ukrainians manage to bluff out. Where on earth would an ordinary Ukrainian who comes to study or work in Poland manage to get 20,000 zlotys? It's just easier to pay 200 zlotys than to pay 20,000. So what I find interesting is his own understanding of the paperwork market and his comparison between 200 zlotys paid to a broker and 20,000 zlotys paid to the Polish state, which then to him start looking like equal actors in enabling mobility from his point of view. And as anthropologist Maybrit Gilles Alps asks, how is the money that aspiring migrants give to consulate officers different from the money they give to migration brokers? And to Igor, the answer is precisely in the ability to escape the grip of the state that forces migrants to labor, save money, and acquire debt to get their visas. What is also interesting, I think, is this moral economy of using these services, as according to Igor, it's very unjust and even wrong that students must pay 20,000 zlotys in order to obtain a residence permit. As he says, where on earth would one get this sum of money? And then I have an example from Katya, who, as she said, didn't use the services herself, but she knew other people were buying papers. And she told me that to get an ID, you should have a registration in Warsaw, like you should have a home address. But landlords don't like to make rental contracts with foreigners, so it's hard for us to make a registration officially. But if you want to get one, you can do that easily, just Google it. These guys have a dormitory, they register you there for a month, so you get a real paper showing that you have a registration in Warsaw, like meaning a home address. You're registered in a dormitory, so you go and get your ID. Then they unregister you and you get your ID. This is all fine. This is a real dormitory, like a real place. You can really live there for a month if you want. So she was trying to kind of normalize and convince me that this is like normal practice. And I think it's important to kind of locate the story in the context of the workings of everyday racism in the housing market, which prevents non-citizens to get an ID and a home address. So buying papers from the dormitory, which Katya says is the real dormitory, then becomes a way to challenge racist practices that prevent migrants from gaining required papers. And what I find particularly interesting here is the blurring of the state and the market boundaries, and how Katya normalized the practice of buying papers as perfectly legal and transparent. So I think that what we can learn from all these stories is that migrants deploy various creative strategies to make use of legal frameworks to secure their residence and challenge migration control. And these strategies should be also analyzed in the context of everyday racism, legal uncertainty, and the architecture of migration, which is intended to tie workers to their employers and place them on the fringes of society. So, and in the second part of my talk, I would like to discuss how these longer-term connections and longer-term presence of Ukrainian migrants affect current situation in Poland. And this month, I met Jana, whom I first encountered in 2020. And like many other Ukrainian people that I met in Warsaw, she was recruited as a student by the representatives of a private Warsaw University who came to visit Jana's hometown in Ukraine. So Jana's migration was enmeshed in a network of recruitment agencies in Ukraine, which work as middlemen and private infrastructures that facilitate migration from Ukraine for work or education. So Jana told me that a recruiter from a Polish university told her classmates about opportunities to get higher education abroad, mainly in Poland and the Czech Republic. And it was a private university, so she said it was very easy to get in. And she said, we had 80 people in our group, only 7 of them were Poles, everyone was from Ukraine and Belarus, a couple of people from Russia and Kazakhstan. And to Jana, getting into a Polish university was a chance to get what others and she referred to as the European education and pursue an idea of a better life in the nearby West, which was embodied to her by Poland. And like many other young people I talked to, She started planning her migration already in high school. Like many others, she spent the last year of high school taking private classes of Polish language in a private recruitment agency. So we should locate Jana's story in the context of Poland's migration, politics, and transnational coordination and intermediary infrastructures. Because recruitment of Ukrainian students has become one of the responses to the demographic decline and emigration of Polish workers. And so various transnational agencies started facilitating migration to Poland and other countries, offering job vacancies, language courses, translation services, and education opportunities. And then Ukrainians were seen as the desirable future workers and students due to their perceived cultural, linguistic, and geographical proximity. But what happens then is that students join labor markets very quickly. And as Jana said, during the second year of my bachelor studies, I couldn't take the fact any longer that my mother had to work so hard. That is why I found work in a hotel. I know my mom had to work very hard to earn this money, so I would feel okay in Warsaw, nothing special, just okay living. So I went to work so my mom could finally breathe. And what Jana says here draws attention, I think, to the costs of social reproduction in migration and how Ukrainian student workers are produced through transnational households, their own labor and the labor of their families. And when Jana found a job in a hotel, this is how she would describe her workday. I wake up at 6. At 8, I'm in the university taking an exam. After that, I go to work in a hotel and work there till 10 in the evening. Or sometimes I would work from 2 p.m. or 4 p.m. till 2 a.m. I used to take a taxi to get home as I was afraid that I would fall asleep on the bus and it would bring me to the end of the line. And actually, when I was in Warsaw and also now, it's very difficult to meet Jana and to stay in touch with her because her work hours are very irregular and she works morning shifts, afternoon shifts, and night shifts. So it's really hard for her to plan ahead what kind of evenings she will have free to have her friends. And that's why it's really hard to be in touch with some people because of this kind of irregular shift hours that people work. And I also met young people whose parents themselves were labor migrants in Italy, Poland, and Russia. And for example, Jana's friend Igor, whom I mentioned earlier, told me that I'm really used to living far away from my family. My mom lived and worked in Italy. My dad left our village to work in Kiev, and then in Moscow. He worked in Poland too. All this to make my studies possible in Warsaw. So Igor's parents were labor migrants, so they could enable his social mobility through education to Poland. But also when we talk about student migrant labor, but also migrant labor in general, it's also important to mention kind of the working conditions which are enabled by this particular contract, which is called this Mobilization. I don't know, maybe somebody will have a better translation than I do, but this contract, which is not really a proper work contract, but a contract that allows very flexible work, unlimited number of hours, which is very popular amongst migrant workers, especially students, as it allows foreign students to combine their studies with work, but also allows them to travel to Ukraine with a short notice to their employers. And many people said that this type of employment contract was very convenient for them as they could travel to Ukraine to visit their families, or this is where they could renew their visas. But this type of contract, the problem is that it doesn't include a paid sick leave, no holidays or health insurance or other forms of protection. So they pay for their own health insurance when applying for a student visa. So the proliferation of this contract is also one of the tools that allows this flexible extraction of labor power, in particular without offering social protection and without contributing to the social reproduction of these workers. But coming back to the current situation, after finishing university in Warsaw, Jana came back to Ukraine and spent a year working there. And when the Russian army started bombing her city on February 24th, she managed to escape Ukraine and get reunited with her boyfriend in Warsaw. And interestingly, she quickly found work in the same hotel where she worked previously as a student worker. And now she lives at her boyfriend's place, who works in food delivery. So, and it's one among many stories that show how Ukrainian migrants host their own relatives, families, and friends in Warsaw, and how the costs of social reproduction are partly outsourced to Ukrainian migrants themselves, who were already in Poland before the Russian invasion and often lived in very precarious conditions with little social protection and discrimination in the labor, in the housing market. And another young woman, which I met at the Central Railway Station in Warsaw last week, who told me that she could only come to Warsaw because her mother has lived here for many years. And in the previous years, she only saw her mother for 2 weeks a year when she was visiting her home in Ukraine. And she would say, where would I go if we didn't have our mother living in Poland? So now she's staying here, not in the refugee reception center, which are being really overcrowded, and the conditions there are quite unhealthy also, because also a lot of diseases are being spread there because of their cramped conditions. So I think it's important to talk about how these migrants who were already in Poland are now hosting their own relatives and kind of sustaining the life. So coming back to the question of who stands with Ukraine, I think it's important to bring to the table the fact that often these are Ukrainian migrants who have lived in Poland for a longer time themselves, reproduce their families and make life possible in the situation of crisis. And I think we should talk more about how the burden of refugee assistance will fall largely on Ukrainian communities, considering the fact that the general burden of survival is placed on the poor in the context of welfare entrenchment across the EU. So, and to start concluding my talk, I was thinking, okay, what is it all about? Is it just another intellectual exercise we're doing here? But I think that we have to be aware that the management of refugees is not purely a humanitarian issue, but it's important to remember that migrants and refugees have always been included into raised markets as workers and non-workers. And Ukrainians have already been included in the EU labor markets as cheap and precarious labor with irregular and long working hours, little social protection, and people had to get into these informal practices of buying migration-related documents to regularize their stay, make their lives more bearable, and resist discrimination in the housing market. And now I think that when everyone starts realizing, including Ukrainian refugees themselves, that the initial solidarity with Ukrainian people is going to fade slowly, the question we should now ask is what kind of labor markets refugees are going to be integrated in, as they were already extremely precarious and deregulated. And also the temporary protection, even though it allows quite a quick response to giving people a residence permit, it doesn't allow people to get into integration courses or learn the language. So basically people are just expected to start working immediately, but without the knowledge of Polish, the question is what kind of labor becomes available to them. And this is all in the context, and we know from previous research that refugee governance in Europe has long relied on refugees' self-reliance, and their survival often falls outside of the purview of state welfare. So I think we can be we should be asking, what does it mean really to say we stand with Ukraine when our humanitarian feelings are so soon going to fade away slowly? And in this presentation, I wanted to suggest that we need to have a conversation about how the costs of social reproduction were long offloaded to Ukrainian households and Ukrainian communities, and how Ukrainian migrant labor in the EU has for a long time been cost-free for the EU, as migrants have been excluded from social provision. And maybe these are the questions we can start and use in our discussion now. Thank you very much.
Thank you. This was very enlightening and very, very interesting. So I don't see anybody, any questions in the chat room, so we can just raise your hand if you want to ask anything. I will take the prerogative of the moderator and ask one clarification question about the money. So do they really have to pay 20K, or do they have to prove that they have 20K in the bank, right? Because those are two different things.
Yeah, they have to prove. They have to prove that they have 20K.
Okay, thank you. All right, so next, who wants to raise a question? Anybody? No. Okay, Isabella has her hand up.
Yes, I have a question about the methodology, because you mentioned talking to people and just observing them and staying with them. I was just wondering if you could say a little bit more about the methodology of your research. So was it were you focused on interactions with migrants, or did you also talk to experts? Or yeah, so just if you could say a bit more about, and also like how, with how many people, from what groups, or were they only students, or did you approach also families and so on? So I would be really eager to learn more about this.
Yes, thank you. I was only talking to migrants. I haven't so far interviewed any experts. But now I'm planning to interview people who are running these different campaigns supporting Ukrainian refugees here, who are coming from other European countries or who come from North America. But for now, I have only focused on Ukrainian migrants themselves. And in the beginning, as I said, because it was just the easiest way to enter the field, was to get acquainted with Ukrainian student workers, because they were quite willing to talk, and even though they wouldn't have a lot of time for that. I didn't talk to those labor migrants who are working in the factories or warehouses, because I didn't have a very easy access to that field, because quite often these factories are situated far away from the city, and it would be just more difficult for me to do that. So I decided to focus on the things I had access to, which were student workers. But slowly, as I started gaining more access to the field and getting to know more people, I think that my networks also started spreading. And I started meeting other friends who just moved, friends of these people who moved as workers. Yes, well, and now I'm also meeting Ukrainian refugees who, for example, volunteer at the central railway station. It's quite interesting that quite often these are Ukrainian refugees and Ukrainian migrants themselves who volunteer and provide information to Ukrainian refugees now who are arriving to Warsaw from Ukraine now.
Thank you. Anybody else? Okay, Pani Monika Szulecka.
Hello, good morning. Thank you very much for this presentation. It was really, really interesting, and interesting, and you asked so many questions that I am also asking myself. I know that like migrant workers, the Ukrainians, they are volunteering now, they are involved in like reception of other refugees. So these are very, very interesting questions, but I would like to go back to the issue of brokers, intermediaries, because I deal with this subject also. Even today, I will try to finalize with my colleague Marta Kindler a paper on labor brokers and social networks. So it is very like close subject to me. And my question is, because I know better the, let's say, the intermediary sector and how they commercialize, let's say, migration from Ukraine to Poland, but from the Polish perspective. And what was interesting for me, I know about this student migrant workers phenomenon. It's very important, of course, and I know also this from the perspective of the migration regime, when this like I don't know, maybe limiting phenomena that were identified by the state as abusing the student visas and so on. But in fact, it is happening, and especially these brokers, intermediary agencies deal with this. And this is the way to enter labor market and to work. And as you said, very important issue to be not attached to one employer. So this gives this freedom. It is important. But you said something that people sometimes prepare to go abroad, and employment agencies, or I don't know what kind of agencies in Ukraine, are offering language courses in Ukraine. Because to be honest, my question, I am asking this question because like our image presented by Ukrainian migrant workers in our studies conducted in Poland, image of intermediaries in Ukraine, to be honest, was rather negative. But I think they pointed more to like informal brokers who cheated and so on. But as you say, this intermediary, I know that it is also, there is a kind of professionalization, cooperation, and so on. So I would like to, if you can say more about these preparations and this offer that really leads people to take work and be prepared, I don't know, with get language skills and so on. I'll be very interested. And one comment, maybe this paperwork, I mean, this was very, very important question asked by Professor Goździak, if they have to prove that they have money, or they have to, they should have this money on an account. I think assisting some migrants and visiting with them the offices, I think that it is a kind of game between migrants and offices. Really, no one believes, I think, that the officials do not believe that these people have this money, but sometimes they even suggest, if people cannot prove having financial resources, they even suggest what you should do, that you can do this account here. It is not important if you have this money. It is important that you bring a paper confirming that you have this money. So it is like very conscious game of both sides, I would say. And it is typical not only for migrant workers, but such services are also developed in the context of other migrant groups in Poland. So this is a comment, but I would be very interested in some insights on reflections on this intermediary sector in Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much, Monica. Well, I would also myself like to study this issue more, this issue of intermediary companies. And I know that it's a two-sided thing because, well, actually, almost everybody I talked to, that they said that somebody came to their school to advertise that, oh, you can go to study in Poland, and then we have this language courses for you, and you can pay, and we will make all the documents. And for some people, I think that also this kind of binary between legal and illegal, it really doesn't help us understand this situation. It's not like all the state and the market, or that the boundaries are so clear. Everything becomes fused, and when people talk about that and how they explain that, for example, just like a couple of days ago, I talked to this woman, and she also paid a company in Ukraine who would help her to make all the documents and to make an invitation from the employer. And when I asked, okay, but is it like a normal office? You just go to the office and it's somewhere in the center of the city and they give you a fake paper. And she says, well, it's not really a fake paper. It's a paper from a real employer. It's just when you arrive to Poland, you don't go to this employer, but it helps you to cross the border. So I think it's this idea of a game, as you said, it's a very good word to discuss it. But I think, like, importantly, and also from previous research, kind of how these boundaries between legal and illegal, that they don't help us understand the situation. But yeah, and then kind of to continue with this metaphor of the game, when people cross the border, and that, for example, it's very clear that they're planning to come to work in Poland, and maybe they would be looking like people who are intending to work, but at the border they will be saying that, yeah, we are going to see like some sightseeing in Warsaw, and then kind of how then the border guards wouldn't recognize that, and then how people get the advice of how you should look like when you cross the border, so that you would really look like a tourist, not like somebody who's coming to work in the construction. But with these intermediary companies, yes, as I said, many students would just say that, yeah, these people would come to the university and then they would pay the money. But I also know that these same companies would be paying, I mean, that they would be sending seasonal workers across Europe. And for example, in Finland, I also met people who were scammed by these by these brokers, and that they would send them fake contracts, and then they wouldn't be able to cross the border or get the seasonal work visa. So it's both enabling and limiting and threatening and making people very vulnerable. But I think the question is, like, why is it that people have to do this kind of practices? Like, what is wrong in the migration regime that people have to start buying documents? And indeed, like, as everybody's saying, like, how would you be able to have this 20K on your bank account as a student? Yeah, but it's indeed very interesting. But I was thinking that now maybe it's not so important anymore because of the war, and during COVID, people had their visas extended automatically. But yeah, we can maybe talk more about that. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Okay, wonderful. So we have two questions. First from Roman Urbanovic in the chat room. And he's saying, how does the nexus of legal impediments and stimuli for integration, both those from 2020 and whatever situation is taking form now, affect your informant's future planning? So in other words, back in 2020, were your interlocutors planning to stay in Poland or maybe move elsewhere? How, if at all, do they exercise their capacity to plan strategically these days?
Yes, thank you. Well, I now ask this question: what are your future plans and what are you going to do? And of course, people say that the capacity of planning has become quite limited because of the war, and that people are not able to come back home. But considering the legal situation, it's quite important that people are now able to stay and in Poland if they were here, living here before the pandemic started, and so that their visas became renewed automatically. So that's kind of that eased the burden of this renewing the permits, because quite many people would actually need to go back to Ukraine to renew their visa and stay there for a month. And that's why many are being employed by this umowa zlecenia, which allows them, okay, just to leave work at any point, go to Ukraine, wait for the renewal of your visa and come back. But during the pandemic and now during the war, it's not possible to move to Ukraine to renew your visa. And applying for a Karta Pobytu is also sounds like a total nightmare, because people have to wait like for a year. Somebody even waited for 1.5 years to have their permit renewed. So that's kind of considering the legal situation, that people are staying with their visas, which are being automatically renewed. But of course, the capacity for longer term planning becomes now totally breached. It's people are not able to talk about their longer term plans at the moment. At least that's my impression. Everybody just hopes that the war will be over soon, and everyone's fear is that it will become this kind of long-term war, as it was already in eastern Ukraine for 8 years. Yeah.
All right. So let me just follow up on Pan Roman's thing, because I don't know if you meant by the legal impediments also the fact that we are all using the word refugee, but Ukrainians will never become refugees. They don't qualify under the convention to be defined as bona fide refugees. So we really have a temporary protection, and not just in Europe, but also in Canada, in the US. And will it be extended, the way, for example, the US government extended the TPS for Salvadorians or Nicaraguans for years now, but that also affects planning. So I think we need to keep that status also in mind. Okay, Pani Natalia Bloch, and then Michał.
Thank you so much, Daria. Yeah, you said about intermediary agencies, which is indeed a fascinating topic, but I am also fascinated with the phenomenon of this vocational schools, szkoły specjalne, which offer this opportunity to legalize one stay, and mostly the Ukrainian migrants stay. So can you elaborate on that a little bit? And I'm wondering how do they make profit on that? Because they're mostly state schools, so the students do not pay the tuition fees, as I know. So this is the first question. And the second one is related to the internal dynamics between the Ukrainian community, because you said a lot, and we know that about the solidarity and Ukrainian migrants hosting those who fled the war. But I'm wondering whether, since you had the opportunity to conduct your fieldwork before and after the war, so have you noticed any tensions among the Ukrainians? I don't know, a kind of resentment related to maybe somehow unequal treatment of the Ukrainian migrants in legal terms, and those who have this temporary protection with regard to the freedom of movement, for example. It's true that those who have been here before war have their visas like renewed or residency permit renewed, but it means that they cannot, for example, travel outside Poland. This is the case of a friend of mine. She's an Ukrainian, and her residency permit will end soon, and she's not able to renew it right now because she said that, okay, you can stay here legally. Yeah, she can stay here, but she can't travel anymore outside Poland. And also with regard to the competition on the labor market. Yeah, so have you noticed something like that? Thank you.
Yes, thank you for these great questions. Well, about the vocational schools, well, I think that it's a very well spread practice and quite a well shared knowledge, because whenever people would say like, yeah, I just renewed my permit via Policalka or something like that. Yeah, but it's indeed like it's so popular because you don't need to pay anything when you enroll there. And I was also asking myself this question, like, how do they make profit? Like, how does this system sustain itself? I don't know, maybe somebody else knows, but when I was asking people, that they said that these schools get money from the state depending on how many students are being enrolled there. Yes, but it's also, again, kind of referring to this metaphor of the game and this kind of phantom studies that they would say that you would, like, no teaching takes place in these vocational schools. And then just like once a month, you have to go there and kind of tick a box that, okay, I came here. And then also the teachers know that this is taking place. Like, everybody knows that this is what's going on. So I'm also wondering about kind of how come this system is still in place if everybody knows that this is kind of a sort of a fake student visa. But so far it works, and it looks like both the vocational schools and the people get their visas, and vocational schools get the money from the state. Yes, and then about the tensions and the resentment and unequal treatment, I haven't yet noticed anything like that. Well, I'm also here just for a couple of weeks, and I'm spending time with volunteers at the railway station, and some people, I mean, like one person I know, he came from North America. He was visiting his mom, and then the war started, and now he is in Warsaw helping others. And now he's saying that, oh, it's so easy to get to Canada now, like Canada opened its doors to everyone from Ukraine, and it gives this gives the visa very easily to come to Canada. But and then he says that when he was going to Canada a couple of years ago, he had to go like through hell to regularize himself and to get documents. And now he also shared this thought with me, like, oh, it's so strange that, like, I mean, he said, I don't know what kind of opinion I should have about the fact that now it's so easy for people to get to Canada while I had to work so hard to get there. But nevertheless, he is still there, and he helps everyone to get the documents to get to Canada anyway, even though he might feel a bit of resentment. But this is just one example. And what but also I can see that now people also start getting tired, that those who are volunteering at the station, that people get a little bit annoyed by stupid questions, and it's like, oh, can't you Google it yourself? So as I said, like, people become quite fatigued by the situation. Yeah, that's my reflections. I can't say much more at the moment. Yes, thank you.
Okay, so remind your Canadian Ukrainian friend that, you know, when he became a landed immigrant, so he had to go through all this stuff, and he's permanent. The Ukrainians that are coming to Canada right now are not there. At least the assumption is that they're not going to stay there permanently. So that's also the legal difference. Okay, I'm going to read Anne's comment, because I think it's related to the Policealne Szkoły. Anne is saying, in my sample of Ukrainians in Piła and Kalisz, there were also genuine students at the schools. So yeah, we should keep that in mind.
Yeah,
okay.
That's true.
Okay, Michał now, and then Pani Magdalena Zabielska.
Okay, thank you very much. Nice to see you again. And yeah, both Elżbieta and you. Yeah, maybe I have two short questions. The first one is perhaps very naive or ignorant. What about language? I know, of course, that these languages, Ukrainian and Russian, are very close related, and that both are used in Ukraine. And does it play any role during your interviews? Yeah, how you are perceived, for instance, when you use Russian towards some Ukrainians. And the second one, in your interesting introduction, you also used the notion of racialization. And since I am working on a project which in the title also have this racialization, I wonder, how do you understand it, and how does it play out in relation to Ukrainians, of the attitudes opposed to Ukrainians or the whole immigrant situation? Does it have any, let's say, interpretative significance?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, thank you. So about the language, of course, well, there are two languages in my field. It's Ukrainian and Russian. I mainly speak Russian, but so far I haven't had any comments or negative reactions or anything like that. But I think it's just the most important thing is to understand Ukrainian, obviously. Just comes, of course, as no surprise. But if you mean kind of my perception, how I'm being perceived in the field and the fact that I speak Russian, it hasn't been a problem at all. And also when I give some advice or like help at the railway station, I also speak Russian and people can speak Ukrainian to me and I respond in Russian, and it hasn't been an issue so far, at least with the people I met. And the question about racialization, yes, I have also worked for a long time with this concept, and I've been interested in this racialization of East European migrants more broadly in the context of Northern, Central and Western Europe. And I think that it's quite a useful and important concept to think about how these processes or that produce difference are being played out. So I think that racialization is the concept that helps us understand how certain capacities, kind of how certain meanings become attached to certain racialized bodies, and how, for example, certain ideas of skills that some migrants or some migrant workers are just better fit for certain sectors of labor because naturally they're more kind of predisposed to certain forms of labor, or that they are just naturally more willing to work, or they're better workers and they are just working harder than like Polish workers. So kind of how these logics naturalize exploitation, and racialization, of course, is always about power and how certain characteristics of people become naturalized and then mobilized to explain exploitation and some exclusionary practices. So I think that if we compare it with ethnicity, for example, I think that ethnicity doesn't do the same work.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I know that you've worked on it in the context, but then this is a new context, yeah, and it's interesting what will be the outcome of your research, yeah, because then it was Eastern European migrants in Northeastern Europe, Northern Europe, let's say, or Northwestern Europe, and now if you use this mental map, yeah, Eastern Europeans in Eastern Europe, yeah, and that's, I wonder what
yeah, but one of the things that people talk about a lot is how they become racialized through accent, because also one of the things that people ask is like, okay, how can we talk about racialization if Poles are white and Ukrainians are white? So what is it kind of, what's the deal here? But kind of that people become visible in the public space quite often through the language. And it's not only that they speak Ukrainian or Russian, but also when they speak Polish, and then the Poles would recognize their accent and then would be like harassed because that they would be singled out as Ukrainians. So racialization also works through kind of audibility and audible visibility, if we can talk about that.
Okay, Pani Magdalena is asking a very interesting question. In their accounts, how did your respondents primarily refer to themselves? Ukrainians, migrants, refugees, victims? Was there anything that caught your attention in this respect?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, but they wouldn't really talk about themselves in the kind of with the third person. So But what is interesting that when especially in 2020, and when I would be hanging out with these student workers, and there were kind of this aspiring middle class people, and when I would say that I'm interested in Ukrainian migration, they would all tell me that I need to go to Warszawa Zachodnia bus station to study kind of real Ukrainian migrants, meaning that these are labor migrants coming from Ukraine, and these are kind of real Ukrainian migrants, but they are normal people. And I mean, of course, they wouldn't use the word normal people, but they would just say, oh, there is really nothing interesting about us. Like, if you're interested in Ukrainians, you should go to Warszawa Zachodnia, then there you find kind of real Ukrainian migrants. And I think that it's again coming back to the question of racialization, how kind of this category of Ukrainian migrant is imagined. Who is a Ukrainian migrant? That this is a laboring subject, working like short term by bus to Warszawa Zachodnia station. And then how these students, even in my research, they would try to distance themselves from this image of Ukrainian labor migrant. Yes. Yeah, but sometimes, yeah, I would also say like, yeah, people wouldn't use this category. Now I don't see people using these categories like refugees, migrants. Quite often you would just ask, like, do you have a stamp in your passport that you crossed the border after the 24th of February to get a free ticket in Poland, or to go to Germany or elsewhere?
Okay, Isabella has her hand up.
Yes, I have a kind of follow-up question to this discussion. So, because you just mentioned like distance from Ukrainian labor market migrants, and we have been conducting also research here in Poznań with different migrants, including Ukrainians, and it was just before the war, so between November and January. And it was also the thing that came out in some of the interviews, that people who were longer for 5-6 years, and they had more, we could say, like established jobs or professional jobs, they were tired of being seen stereotypically as like uneducated Ukrainians working at the construction sites. So so there was this image that that in the Polish society, people are seen as people from Ukraine were seen as working in the construction industry and these low and factories, and they want to see themselves differently. So I'm coming to the kind of question. So when you talk to students, some of them I assume also studied at the university maybe, and not only in this vocational school. So maybe they had some more, maybe they had some ideas about more professional development in the future. So did you come across such people, and what was their idea, what they would like to do when you talked to them in 2020? What was their plan, or was it just a kind of very temporary situation that they were managing from day to day, or did they have a long-term plans of staying in Poland and establishing themselves professionally in the field of their studies? Sorry.
Yeah.
So that's the question. And maybe I could have a short comment also about vocational schools. I don't really see them as a kind of abuse of the system. I think it's part of the system of just making money out of education, like private universities or even public universities with paid programs. And I think that it's at the end, you know, the teachers get the money, the institution gets the money, students get education. Some of them drop off after a few weeks or months or never go there, like at the public school, and just get the paper they needed. So in a way, like some of the students I talked to, they said they went to those schools even just to get some possibility to practice Polish, and not really to learn about making bouquet or some other quite strange subjects to study. So, I think it's more complicated, the whole system of vocational schools, and maybe in this larger context, it's just a question of privatization of the educational sector.
Yeah. Thank you for this. Yeah, talking about the ideas about the professional development in the future, but many would say that they're just so tired of studying because that they came to Poland to study and they would actually get a degree, like a bachelor degree in something, and then that they would move to Szkoła Policjalna to get their papers, or maybe even probably to get a degree as well. And then some would even move like again to the next to the next vocational school, and they would be saying like, okay, now we have 3 professions, like I'm an economist, I'm a masseuse, and like some kind of bouquet bouquet maker, and they say like, okay, it's really enough with the studies now. But with a few exceptions of those who started working in IT, most of the people were employed in the service sector jobs, or like in call centers, or in restaurants, or in food delivery. So despite despite the fact that they got higher education in Poland, like genuinely that they came here to study, this education wouldn't give them necessarily access to the jobs for which they were trained. And so people had different plans. Some were thinking of moving back to Ukraine. Others were thinking to staying in Poland and getting like proper documents, maybe like a permanent residence in Poland. And many were also thinking that, okay, Poland is this kind of first step in Europe, and then there are other steps, like Germany should be the next one. And then many were thinking of moving further west. Yeah, so there were quite different trajectories. But now, at least some of the people I met, like now, many of them stayed in Poland after 2 years, and they're still here.
Pani Monika has her hand up again.
Thank you very much. I would like to, if I can, I would like to follow up, because I used the word abuse. So I feel that I should now respond to this. I would like to explain that I didn't mean that everything is like, an abusive practice or something like this. Not at all. When I focus on the word paperwork, and when I think that papers like, when we see the role of intermediaries who, I don't know, they have on the table some possibilities, some routes, and they choose the student visas and they offer this a path to people who did not plan to, to learn anything, who did not, in general, they didn't have education in their plans. It is vocational education, any education, and they are offered this possibility. So I mean rather such situations. Then you have to, but then when you choose some paths because they are easier, give more bigger, higher flexibility and so on. So I wouldn't like to leave everyone with the thought that I see all these things as abusive practices. Not at all. I also know people who just, who gained new competencies, and they can use these competencies now, but as Daria said a minute ago, it is difficult to use these competencies, especially if people lack language competencies in Polish, especially if these are jobs connected with some medical professions and so on. So this may be the problem, but this is we speak about genuine and so on. When I focus on the role of these intermediaries, then we see this how they play, how they negotiate with this migration control, migration regime. And maybe I am not ready to cite exactly what people said, but we had in our interviews with migrant Ukrainian workers, not students usually, but migrant Ukrainian workers, we heard that some of these people are really conscious that what they are buying, for what they are paying, these are only papers. They are not buying, they say, I will find my work independently, work that I want, that I trust and so on, I will find this independently. Everything I need now is to convince the border guards at the border that I am going to work. So
Yeah.
this is like, I think this is the aspect that I'm very interested in. But of course, I know that the whole, even migration industry works for the benefit of this formal migration, regular migration, and so on. But some people are more interested in some people, and especially control agents, state-controlled agents are interested and call this identified as abuses. But it is interesting what they see. So I know that for, I don't know, for the border guards, vocational school is like a red lamp, but on the other hand, for migration scholars, we know that there are people who really get education, get some professions, and so on. So, and about this distancing, also from the perspective of research conducted here in Warsaw or in the vicinities, I would like to say that such distancing, I think that we saw this distancing when the scale of immigration from Ukraine to Poland increased. We saw people who in 2014, 15, 16, in these years, they were coming like whole families, especially from Eastern Europe. And if they had social capital, human capital, they try to like adapt independently. And for us, it was, these were like very important questions then. If you try to connect with other people and they say no, these other people, they work, as Isabella said, in construction and so on. We don't want to be, I don't know, maybe not associated. We are also Ukrainians, but we like want to have normal life here. And being a person with identified as a person with some, I don't know, capacity to deal or to organize, to arrange something, then they are afraid that they were afraid that they would be contacted by others and asked for something. And they like, this is not normal life if you have to be like unintentional broker or something like this. But there are also people who are very much involved in supporting others in adaptation, which we see now, because these volunteers, these are people who are ready to work for others, but in very special context now. So.
Yeah, thank you. I also completely agree about this kind of narrative of abuse, and then this stigmatization of brokers and intermediary companies, that it almost seems like, okay, if we get rid of brokers, then we'll have this beautiful, fair and just migration control system. And then, or if only everybody would doing things legally through the state. But if we think about kind of the state itself, and kind of why don't we think about the state, the nation state as the broker? Yes, so I totally agree with you about this, especially this this danger of like stigmatizing these intermediary agencies and brokers, and then kind of treating the state as the kind of normal and a fair system. Yeah.
Okay, so Pani Agnieszka Minkowska is actually, it's a good follow-up. She's wondering whether you have talked to anybody who was assisted by labor offices or career centers at their schools. And her second question is whether you've seen any indication of state coordination of the labor market.
Yes, thank you for this question. Well, I didn't hear anyone mentioning help from the labor office or from career centers. Most of the people, when they talk about how they gain jobs, is through their own networks. That's the answer that you gain most of the time. And even people who just arrive and they call somebody and say, okay, is there any job for me? And then somebody will get them a job. And of course, it will be quite a vulnerable position, because people will be employed without any contracts. But I haven't heard anybody mentioning labor offices or career centers. and state coordination of labor market. I'm not sure I understand the question. Do you mean kind of how people are being integrated through certain programs, or could maybe Agnieszka explain?
Whatever. I mean, just something which could, like, you know, like evoke some idea that there is something going on about the labor coordination or something, like you may guess
Now,
that they know they can be supported, or they have the knowledge that they can be consulted or whatever.
Well, so far I haven't seen anybody like relying on any support from anyone. And especially with this contract, the Mobilization, like you're basically a self-employed person. Like if you're ill, nobody will pay you your sick leave, no paid holidays, and people work for years with these contracts. So I think that people just learn to rely on themselves, and also on these extended households. Like if something happens, they go to Ukraine and stay with their parents for some time, renew their visas there, but kind of the idea that there is the state or welfare structures that will help and protect them, nobody talks about that.
No, the question was just rhetoric. I mean, I don't expect this, but I would be very nicely surprised if you said something different. But it's just to comment, I think it's a risk of just because people they are left themselves, which is okay. I mean, that it's how it is. But talking about this vocational schools or agencies, I think there is a risk of really high regulation of the system, like from the micro perspective of the industrial relations, and abuse of some forms of work agreements, which are not really the best options, or maybe there is like a kind of allowance of abusing this kind of solutions. And from my perspective, my experience is also like, and at the end, the migrants themselves, they are paying the fee, or they are rejected by the head office, and they end up with this negative decision from the state. So they are not allowed to continue, they say, in Poland because of some abuses, maybe illegal, the regulations, which they are not responsible for. For example, as a students, they should not work on some, there is a limited time of work per week. I mean, there are some regulations about it, and they are not conscious about it, but the agencies, they sign the contracts which are attractive because of the income, but they are not aware of it. But at the end, the final decision is at the home office, and they are rejected because of those abuses. But on their way, no, like labor offices or labor inspection offices are not observing, not checking, not changing those practices.
Yeah,
and this is also probably the explanation of the reason why it takes so long now in Poland to each person must wait more than 1 year for the decision, because the institution which is checking each case also is checking all those legal issues, which are not, you know, this is not up to the student or somebody from the vocational school, right? But at the end, they have to pay for it, right? Yeah, rejected.
Yeah.
So there is no state during those processes, just the migrant and their life, and then there is a decision. Right?
Yeah.
So from
Okay, we only have 5 more minutes left. So Daria, do you want to a response to that?
Well, I could only add also about these brokers that this, when we think about brokers, it can be an individual person who just promises somebody to get their residence permits, or there can be whole agencies which will be like working in proper offices somewhere in the center of the city. So also how we imagine who is the broker, it can be from both and just individual and the kind of some company.
Pani Monica had her hand up, but now the hand is down.
If I can only shortly comment that the state labor inspectors, they see all these problems and they are aware of this cause, that it is like reinforcing the precarious status and not proper contracts and so on. And year by year, they repeat recommendations what should be done in this intermediary sector. Nothing is changing. And I agree that we don't have like the state, the state authorities did not answer the question, what should be the role of the intermediaries? And especially during the COVID, it was clear for me that like it was really, they could act openly and did what they want, and not everything was for the benefit of migrant workers. So changing companies, changing names, forms, just to avoid, they work legally sometimes, but it does not mean that it is really, that it secures the status and potential for further legalization for migrants. So last comment, sorry for speaking too much today.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, that's the point.
Daria?
Yeah, just thank you for making notes here.
So we're almost out of time, but I just wanted to maybe voice an encouragement and ask one question. So the encouragement would be, because from this discussion, it seems to me like people are very hungry also for data coming from the experts and that sort of thing. But I would also put a big plug in for interviewing employers, because in the labor migration field, so often we only talk to the labor migrants, but we never talk to the employers. It's not easy. I'm not suggesting it's easy, but that would be my encouragement. And then my question would be, do you have any, because you mentioned, and my ears perked when you mentioned that this research has also an applied aspect. So I am wondering, what are your plans to disseminate your findings outside the academic circles?
Yeah, thank you. Well, I haven't thought about it maybe so carefully, but I think writing for a wider audience is one option, and not just writing the academic articles for paywalls. Yeah, so my plan would be like to write for the general audience, but I don't think I have access to any policymakers, and I'm sure that there are a lot of great researchers in Poland who are also very good and already doing that.
And also thinking about the migrants themselves as an audience, and especially since you speak Russian, right? I assume right in Russian as well. Yeah. I mean, that would be that's an audience we always forget.
Yes.
Okay. So 1 minute to spare. Anybody has any last question for Daria or a last comment? If not, we will thank her. Okay, so thank you very much. This was really great and very informative, and hopefully, since you are in Poland again, hopefully we'll hear from you. Keep us appraised on how the research is going, and good luck.
Yes, thank you very much. Okay. Thank you for the invitation, for the great discussion.
Bye-bye.
Thank you a lot.